Okay, I've scarily put myself back on camera because it's always nicer to answer questions face to face. I'm aware that I've come back on a minute early. I have restarted the recording, so we have got a record of any questions asked if anyone has one to ask. Can I ask that you use the little yellow hand function? I'm sure someone will shout out if you then have what we've come to know as a legacy hand. So are there any questions so far? Can one of my lovely colleagues on the Pupil Access and Inclusion team just confirm that I am once again broadcasting?
You are.
Yes, you are.
Lovely.
Yes, you
Thank
are.
you. It is, I've got to say to everyone, it must be so hard for you all on the other end of this, but it is such a strange experience. I've done this now to chairs of governors and vice chairs. I've done it to governors. I've done a version to DSLs. It is so strange to be talking out into the ether. It really is. Okay. I'm hoping everyone's back. Has anyone got any questions so far about Dudley's inclusive pathways? Okay, I'm taking that as a positive. Hopefully that means the guidance is fairly accessible and straightforward. Hopefully it means that my presentation this afternoon hasn't been too bad, although I am slightly wondering if it's put everyone to sleep. So if there aren't any burning questions at the moment, what we'll do is move on to now the shorter section, and again at the end I'll offer chance for any questions. And because we are going to talk about necessary exclusion and touch on the statutory framework for that, colleagues on the Access and Inclusion team are on the line and they might help me with some of the responses towards the end of the session. So I'll just make sure that I can see what I'm presenting as well. You are all familiar with the DfE's guidance on exclusion from maintained schools, academies and pupil referral units in England. There have been no updates of the guidance in full since 2017. However, this link here takes you to any updates in light of COVID. What I can tell you is it does explain the process for holding meetings virtually, if that's appropriate. The only change to timescales at the moment until the end of March is the timescale can be varied as regards response to request for an IRP. The other timescales, although they were varied during the first national lockdown, have reverted to usual. It's just that one timescale that can be varied. However, we do know that the government changed things rapidly at the moment, so please make sure that you have got access to that hyperlink should new guidance or should another variance of the guidance be published. The document I'm hoping you're also familiar with, because it was actually published in September, is Dudley's supplementary exclusions guidance. Along with the Pupil Access and Inclusion team, the Alternative Provision Strategy brought this guidance together in response to heads who quite rightly said that there are gaps in the DfE guidance. There are many things that aren't expanded that head teachers and governing bodies would like to be expanded. So we've aimed to do that with the supplementary exclusions guidance. So again, I'm sorry, I'm just going to teach you to suck eggs for one more minute. The decision to exclude a pupil must be lawful, reasonable and fair. There must be no discriminatory practice against pupils. I'm sure you're all aware of the case law that underpins this. We're looking at all of the education law, the principles of natural justice, the Equality Act and the Human Rights Act underpin the DfE guidance on exclusions, so there can be no discriminatory practice. And just to remind you again that schools should give particular consideration to the fair treatment of pupils from groups who are vulnerable to exclusion. That includes children with education, health and care plans for whom exclusion should not take place. Didn't say they cannot, but should not take place. Children who are looked after, children who are post looked after or adopted. Other vulnerable groups include children with special educational needs and children who are subject to pupil premium. All of those children fall in groups that have an over-proportional representation in children who do experience permanent exclusion. If you are in the difficult position of having to undertake a permanent exclusion, can I say the Access and Inclusion team are absolute stars. If you ring the team or if you email the exclusion email address regarding a permanent exclusion, you will get the lovely tones of Angela Hale and Tracy Downing. They do not bite. Many of you have spoken to them on many occasions. The team are there to help you with reporting the issue of a PX. They are there to help you with templates for the legal recording and issue of PX. They are there to give advice regarding establishing your disciplinary hearing, the panel composition, the timeframes. They are there to provide access to the LA exclusion officer for disciplinary hearings. That's in the case of maintained settings. They are also able, via the exclusions officer, to provide you with a paperwork check to ensure that your paperwork is robust, but please ensure it comes through ahead of the time when you need to get it out. It's much harder for the team or the exclusions officer to look at your paperwork and give you sometimes support, sometimes challenge if you've already sent it out to meet the deadline for paperwork being received by the disciplinary panel and the family. They're there for you to notify of the outcome of any disciplinary hearing, and they're there to give advice regarding the appeals timescale. I'm not going to go through in detail the timescale for this process, and that's because the wonderful Angela Hale, following her many years of working in her role in Dudley, has produced 2 invaluable tables within the exclusions guidance that take you through day by day what you need to do, what should be done, what must be done at every stage of the permanent exclusion process. Just a few reminders then. Permanent exclusions, the decision can only be made by the head teacher or the teacher in charge, but the DfE guidance does state that they mustn't be made in the heat of the moment. For this reason, many schools issue a fixed term exclusion whilst the investigation is underway. Can I just make clear that if you are doing so, the wording of your letter about the fixed term exclusion needs to be careful. It needs to say that you are issuing a fixed term exclusion that may result in permanent exclusion dependent on the outcome of the investigation. It cannot say that the fixed term exclusion will become or convert to a permanent exclusion. Any investigation that leads to issue of a permanent exclusion, the permanent exclusion is issued separately to the fixed term exclusion. It cannot be a conversion, and the guidance is really clear on that. So there must be a thorough investigation to consider all available evidence. It must take account of your school policies, the law and relevant procedures. And when we talk about policies relevant to permanent exclusion, all schools submit the behaviour policy for the school. Very few submit the SEND policy or any safeguarding policy. We talked earlier on this afternoon how they should be implicit within your behaviour policy. So if you are putting together your head teacher pack with relevant policies to exclusions for your school, I would advise that you consider that your SEND policy and your safeguarding policy could be relevant to the exclusion. You need to allow and encourage the pupil to give their version of events. You need to check whether there were other reasons for the incidents, such as provocation. You need to consult with others who were involved in the situation and get their version of events. And you need to keep a written record of all actions taken. When considering the decision to permanently exclude, if the evidence is sufficient, if it's on the balance of probabilities, then the exclusion can be issued. And the balance of probabilities is whether it is more likely to have happened or not. And those are the areas that the governing body, the disciplinary committee, will consider. I do want to say here, I apologise that the governor training on inclusive pathways and supplementary exclusions guidance happened the week before half term. The only way we could schedule all of this was the way round that we've done it. So that governor training has taken place. Governors are aware of permanent exclusion within the inclusive pathways framework. So in terms of evidencing the need to permanently exclude, you as a head teacher, when issuing that exclusion and when evidencing it for your disciplinary committee, are going to need to evidence that the behaviour was in breach of the school policy, that there has been partnership working with others to address the underlying causes of disruptive behaviour, including assessment of whether appropriate provision is in place. You're going to need to evidence that multi-agency assessment has explored all aspects of need, including mental health or the needs of the family. And you are going to have to evidence that statutory process has been followed for children and young people with an EHCP and those who are looked after. It's why I've been on my soapbox this afternoon. You're also going to have to consider whether allowing the child to remain in school would seriously harm the education or welfare of other children, young people and staff. And the supplementary exclusions guidance covers all of those three areas. So what I'm going to do is give you an overview. If you're not familiar with that guidance, I'm going to give you an overview of what is there to support you in knowing that you have evidenced reasonably what you've done. So under the section for breach of behaviour policy, it does prompt you back to the DFE guidance. It does prompt you to consider whether your behaviour policy has underpinned an inclusive ethos. It does prompt you to these key questions about a behaviour policy breach. When a child breaches a behaviour policy, is there anything happening at school that might in some way explain their behaviour? Has anything happened at school in the past that needs to be taken into consideration? For example, peer relationships, staff relationships. Is there anything currently happening at home or outside school that might in some way explain their behaviour? Has anything happened at home or outside school in the past that needs to be taken into consideration? Can I draw your mind back to the example about sensory integration and the young man who in year 8 refused to go into maths? And what other factors may have contributed to the poor behaviour? If you're reflecting on all of those and there is an answer that needs addressing to any of those, you need to evidence that you have met that child's needs given what's going on for them. It also prompts you again about the correlation between challenging behaviour and SEND, and that idea that your pastoral team and your SEND team need to be working together. And it gives models of good practice for considering whether a behaviour breach has taken place. When it comes to identifying that when it comes to evidencing that you've identified a met need, that section of the guidance is there to ensure that you are confident that you've undertaken a graduated SEN response and that you've made an offer of early help using early help enablers as needed, that you've responded in a timely manner, that sufficient time has been given for the establishment of any multi-agency advice and support. Think back to that phrase in exclusions paperwork where the actual training had been requested, the training had started to be delivered to staff, but the exclusion took place before it had been implemented and embedded. It's there to ensure that you have engaged with the inclusive pathways, they are evolving, but that you have reflected on approaches to preventative work with the LA Inclusion Officer and the Access and Inclusion team. They're there to make sure that you have met your obligations under your SEN policy and your SEN information report. They are relevant documents to your exclusion. Can I ask that you consider that your SENCO either supports in the writing of your head teacher report or actually joins you in the exclusion hearing if you are going to robustly evidence that you've done what is needed to identify and meet need? Can I advise you as well to make sure that all staff have regular SEND training, and I advise this to the disciplinary hearing committee as well. In Dudley, we advise that you consider using the Oxford model of head teacher report, and I'm going to show you an extract of that in just a second. Can I also urge you to ensure that if you're including behaviour logs, they are more than just a log of poor behaviour. They are also an intervention chronology, and they include the potential to record details of the child's engagement, what interventions have gone into place and what impact they've had. Can I also ask you to acknowledge that, and we talked about this earlier, limited or no impact of an intervention actually should prompt a review of that intervention informed by further assessment of need. This is about an ongoing cycle of assess, plan, do, review. I'm going to put up an extract from the Oxfordshire model of head teacher report to inform disciplinary meeting. What I will say, this isn't here to evidence that it's about quantity, it's about quality of what you put in that report to evidence that you've identified and met need. And what I will say is I advise you to do the so what test. If anyone on that disciplinary committee or the parent or their advocate can say so what to one of the statements in that evidence, there is an indicator that you have not fully evidenced the impact of what you've done. So, for example, education psychology referral made. That could beg the question, so what? When was it made? What happened as a result? What did the educational psychologist service say? How has that changed how you've met that child's needs? So the example there is of how, and I know it looks like a lot of words, and as I say, this isn't about quantity, it's about quality. The example is there broken down into what you've done to assess, how you did your plan and do, and the review that took place to robustly evidence that you are meeting your need under the SEND code of practice. And probably the most difficult section of the guidance is about evidencing education and welfare of others. We all know that children who present with persistent disruptive behaviour disrupt their own learning and the learning of others, and teaching. We all know that is a really challenging thing to deal with. We all know that a serious breach of behaviour policy can have ripples outwards across all year groups and across the school community. But balanced with that, I want you to think back to the impact of permanent exclusion on children and young people's outcomes that we talked about in the Timpson review earlier. Thinking about permanent exclusion as a proportionate response. Have you done everything reasonable to meet that child's needs? And within the guidance, there are 2 case studies for consideration. Now, I did one of the case studies with the governors, and whilst it was really good to put it up on screen, taking feedback on it in a virtual meeting like this was really difficult. There is a case study aimed at secondary and a case study aimed at primary. They are based on real exclusions in Dudley over the last 3 years. And I make no apology that within those case studies, there are points for consideration as to whether those exclusions should have gone ahead. This section of the guidance is also about minimising risk when considering reinstatement. So if you are considering, or if the disciplinary committee consider reinstatement, it's about making sure there's a risk assessment there, and it's about making sure that any reinstatement is actually successful and not just a breathing space before another permanent exclusion. Just to remind you, the decision of a permanent exclusion disciplinary hearing can be appealed. A parent can request an independent review panel to review the exclusion, and they can actually make a claim to the first tier tribunal for disciplinary discrimination or a county court for other forms of discrimination. So we've put this guidance together to prompt you at every stage to ensure that permanent exclusion is a necessary and appropriate non-discriminatory process for a child or young person in really difficult situations. As it says there, independent review panel, whether you have said that the child has special educational needs or not, a parent has the right to request the presence of an SEN expert at that independent review panel, and that expert will be there to actually consider whether school has fulfilled its duty under the SEN Code of Practice. In terms of IRPs, to give you an idea for Dudley, over the last couple of years, there has been a slight downward trend, and obviously that could be for many reasons, including lockdown. 2018 to 19, there were 3 IRPs requested, 2 were upheld and 1 recommended that the governors reconsidered. In 2019 to 20, again, 3 IRPs were held, 2 were upheld, and in 1 the decision was quashed by the IRP panel. And in the last 2 years so far, we've had 1 IRP in each of the years. 1 last year recommended the governors reconsidered the decision, and 1 this year so far has been upheld. There's a reminder there what can happen as the outcome of an independent review panel. I have talked long and hard this afternoon. I am sure there are questions. As I say, I have got colleagues from the Pupil Access and Inclusion team on the line. If there's anything that I don't know immediately, I may just ask them to jump in. But it is, by my watch, almost 3:20. I did say I would finish for 3:30, so I'd like to open up now for any questions that you have, and I will do my best to answer them. Mr. P. Townsend.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Just a quick question, if you could, just to clarify, you know, you talked about the Oxfordshire model
Yes.
to look at. with all the changes in the policies and procedures, is that going to be updated? Because I don't know if I've got this wrong. Wasn't that from 2012?
Yeah, their guidance was at the moment, I mean, that was recommended to us actually by a Dudley head teacher who'd seen that guidance and felt that it was the most appropriate and robust way for a head teacher to evidence that they had taken all reasonable steps. Whether I haven't seen any update to it from Oxford, I think because it's widely accepted as a really good model, they haven't seen a need to update it yet. I'd like to think at some point in Dudley we could do a very similar thing.
Yeah, my concern will be all the new things you're talking about in the graduated response and everything couldn't possibly be in that because it didn't exist when at the time of that was written. So really, they just need to work together, don't they? Both the policies.
What I've done is included it as an example, because what you would need to do is evidence your school's response to the graduated response through using that model. The model is there to reassure you that you've covered evidence in how you've assessed, evidence in what you've planned and what you've done, and evidence in the impact.
Lovely, thank you.
Okay. All gone really quiet. I'm guessing then that there are no more burning questions. I'm sure there will be once you've come off this session and you've got time to think of other things than Boris Johnson's announcement last night and the impact on you and your staff for not just the next 2 weeks, but the rest of this academic year. If I could ask, if they're about inclusive pathways, if you could send them to the inclusive.pathways email address, and if they're about exclusions, if you could send them to the exclusions address, we will make sure that someone answers them appropriately at the earliest possible point. I think all that's left for me to say is thank you for your time this afternoon. Thank you for putting up with me being on a soapbox and talking about a really difficult situation that is close to my heart professionally and personally. Thank you for everything you do day in, day out, through holidays, for not closing despite what Boris keeps telling people. Thank you for supporting children and young people in Dudley day in, day out, as you do, because you really are making a huge difference to every child in Dudley, but particularly Dudley's most vulnerable children. And for that, I would like to thank you, and thank you for being so engaged with Dudley's Inclusive Pathways. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thanks. It's really weird now watching everyone leave.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been really useful.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Let me just stop the recording.